Charles. Charles the First. Charles, King of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Charles, martyred, 30 January, 1649. Charles, the saint. Well, today we're going to consider why Charles has this most unusual title for a British king, particularly a British king who reigned after the Reformation. Saint. Well, very simply, King Charles I of England was executed on the order of his Parliament and canonized by the Church of England 13 years later as a martyr saint. The reason? Charles was a staunch cradle Anglican. That means someone who's born to Anglican parents and raised as an Anglican. He refused to yield to the Presbyterianism or Puritanism of Parliament. He tolerated the faith of his wife, a Roman Catholic, and he believed it was God alone who had given him his throne, and that he must at all costs protect and remain true to his faith and church. Well, all of that cost him his head, but he ended up with a halo. Charles is unique. You know, he's the only person, not just the only king, but he's the only person who's been canonized or made a saint by the Anglican Church. So this seems to be an ideal time to understand a bit more about our church's history and its attitude to saints. To understand how this all came about, we really have to go back a bit, since it all started with the Reformation, which lasted roughly from 1517 to 1648, 131 years. So it was a long time of turmoil in the Christian world. There have been previous attempts to reform, and they started to translate the Bible into English. Wycliffe did that. And on the continent, there were various people who had objected to what was going on. But nothing really got off the ground until Martin Luther came along. And Martin Luther put together the 95 gripes and complaints people had against the church. And he made this into a thesis, and he nailed it up on the door of the church in Wittenberg in Germany in 1517. And it railed against clerical abuses, especially nepotism, that's giving jobs to people you're related to, simony, usury, pluralism, and the sale of indulgences. The sale of indulgences was big business, and it really riled the people who couldn't see justification for it in the Bible. So what started out largely as a Northern European movement against papal practices has to be seen in the larger context of changing times. The Renaissance came along and it freed up ideas. The notion of nationalism, which really hadn't existed. You lived in a village or in a community and you had a leader in a relatively small principality kind of thing. But the notion of nationalism was beginning. There was a freeing ideas, increasing access to education, but most important of all was the invention of the printing press. Up until that time, if you wanted to communicate with someone, it had to be done by hand. And if what you had communicated to them wanted to be sent on to somebody else, it also had to be written out by hand. So you had all these scribes, you know, with their quill pens working away, but it was a very slow process. Along comes the printing press, and what previously would have taken years to do is suddenly done in a matter of hours or days. It also meant that the Bible was much, much more broadly circulated. In fact, part of Reformation in England ended up with a law that said there had to be a Bible in every parish. Now, we think today, if you don't have a Bible in your home, I mean, what kind of... But can you imagine? For over 1,000 years, virtually 1,500 years, there was no expectation that there would be a Bible in a parish, because who could read it? Well, suddenly, all this is changing. And as people get their hands on the Bible and get their hands on education, they start looking in it for the things they've been taught. Because they've always been told everything comes from the Bible. That's the sole authority. And when you start looking in there and you don't find something that your local priest is doing, you say, well, show me where it says in the Bible you have to do that, or I have to do that, more importantly. And that was the start of the Reformation. Initially, England had stood against this reform. Indeed, Henry VIII was given the title which has gone through all generations of English monarchs ever since, for his defense of the Roman Catholic faith. And when we say Roman Catholic now, it's to define, but in those days there was just one church. It was the Catholic, at least in the West, and it was the Catholic Church. Later defined as the Roman Catholic because you started getting so many other varieties of it. But he was given the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope. And the Queen still is Defender of the Faith. Now, what happened was he was very aware, because he was quite a biblical scholar. And he understood what people were upset about. But you know, when you rebel against the church and you're in government, it makes your position kind of twitchy. If they don't like the church, the next thing they might not like is the monarch. So we better stick together, has been the history. And you see it in the Middle East today, where Muslim leaders may well not approve of some things that are going on, but if I disagree, what happens to my position of power? It happens everywhere. So initially he had stood firm, but then he saw politics of Rome interfere with his own life because he hadn't had a son. He was concerned, he was only the second of the Tudors to be king. He was concerned that his line was going to die out. He couldn't imagine a woman being able to be the monarch. And his wife had passed childbearing age. So he went to the Pope and explained how he had married his brother's widow, and that was against what the Bible said, and therefore he should have a divorce, because God obviously disapproved of the marriage, not having given him a son, or any sons he had given having died virtually at birth. Yeah, seemed like a reasonable issue, lots of theology on his side, but the Pope had to turn him down because his wife happened to be the aunt of the King of Spain. And at that time, the King of Spain controlled the Pope. It sort of alternated between Spain and France, who had the upper hand in Rome. Well, as a result, Henry decided that national interests had to take precedence over obedience to the Pope, and so created a national church. But it wasn't very different. It was just a national church. Well, he was in opposition to some of the practices of Rome, but mainly he was in opposition to their interference with how England was governed. When he died, things changed. He left 3 children, and his children drew the nation into that turmoil in an unbelievable fashion. His first child, Edward VII, was very Protestant, and so the nation swung very Protestant. He died. His eldest sister, Mary, became queen. She was very Roman Catholic, and so the nation swung very Roman Catholic. She died. Then along comes Elizabeth I, and she was very Protestant, but in the Calvinist type Protestant, but she still liked all the fancy dress. And up in Scotland, John Knox was doing the same thing up there, turning that country into a very Calvinist state. Elizabeth died without children after a long reign. And so then the King of Scotland, James VI of Scotland, of the Stuart line, a cousin of hers, becomes James I of England, and the defender of the faith of the Anglican Church. He's the person who our King James version of the Bible is named after. And religion to him was one of his many roles and responsibilities as monarch, but he left theology and the running of the church to the churchmen. His son and heir, Henry, was being trained to follow in his father's footsteps. But then tragedy occurred. He contracted typhoid fever and died in 1612. And in Henry's place, his younger, sickly, stammering brother Charles became crown prince, and in 1625 succeeded his father. Well, Charles I, as he was known, embraced the splendor of the Church of England and the doctrine of the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings was held by most monarchs at that time. It's the authority to rule is given by God, not by the people, not by Parliament. It's given by God, and you're anointed by God's representatives on earth. And after that, disloyalty to you is disloyalty to God, to the country, to everyone. Some kings took it more seriously than others. But with that also comes the responsibility to defend the church against innovation and change. Charles saw it as his duty to return the church to what was established by Christ. And that was clearly without a pope or any external authority. However, he's also devoted to the Anglican Church's elaborate rituals, including prescribed prayers, the calendar of worship, placing importance on observing Lent and fast days, which is hardly consistent with the practices of Christ, as I read them in the Bible, and certainly not consistent with the ideas of the Reformation. Another thing he was committed to, apostolic succession. That's the direct chain that goes from the apostles laying hands on those they chose to lead to the present day. And bishops are supposed to have had that laying on of hands since Christ's time. His predecessors have protected that practice, but it was very unpopular with the more Protestant of the citizenry. And all changes, no matter what they were unpopular with the Roman Catholics in Britain, including his own wife, a Roman Catholic from France, Queen Henrietta Maria, who held the belief that she would restore the true church. Charles didn't desire that, even though many people accused him of it, and he ensured that the royal children were raised as good Protestants and Anglicans. On the continent, the same divisions were resulting in wars that would continue for generations to come. And in England, the divide grew between the king's support for his archbishop and his desire for an orderly, ceremonious British church that would inspire religious awe with its beauty of holiness, as he put it, where clergy in ornate robes would celebrate the sacraments, and the reformers, well, they didn't agree with any of that. So the divide grew. They wanted only the most unadorned of buildings. They would have been very happy worshiping with us here. Plain walls, no fancy stained glass windows. I'm in the right, black and white. They wouldn't have approved of this, but it's plain. It's not all gold and gilded and woven. And preaching the word for hours was really one way you divide the two. The reformers wanted endless sermons, and the more traditionalists wanted the sacrament of Holy Communion at the center of worship. And a homily was just sort of an aside that wasn't terribly important. The more the church got directed to ceremony, the more they were held up to scorn as popish superstition and idolatry. And in both England and Scotland, the people feared that the steps that were being taken were heading towards a return to Rome. Let me give you an example of where the king's responsibility and the Puritans really clashed. There was something called the royal touch. It was the laying on of hands by the monarch to cure his subjects of various skin disorders. And it was believed that the gift of healing was bestowed on the monarch at the time of his coronation. This is based on passages from the Gospel that confirmed the monarch's immunity to infectious diseases. They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. And Charles absolutely believed in this power. He applied this touch to over 92,000 scrofulous people during his reign. That's over 4,500 people that he prayed over and blessed and laid his hands on every year. That's a lot of people. And the practice didn't end until the Stuarts did in 1712, when Charles' granddaughter, Queen Anne, blessed 300 people at the final audience. Thereafter, the power of Parliament and monarch established an accord based on a clear definition of their two complementary roles. It wasn't seen as necessary, but superstitious by the new generation of Protestant leaders. And the new German monarchs acquiesced and ended the royal role in healing the sick of the nation. So it's something that we don't do now, but it was something that was terribly important to people on both sides of the issue, and it was just so many things like that that had divided the king from his parliament and the more Puritan side of his nation. Eventually, war resulted between the king and parliament. Charles was absolutely unwilling to cede any of his powers, particularly in religious matters, because he believed they had been given to him by God himself and only God could take them away. The war, when it came, lasted from 1642 to 1651, but in 1648 Charles was defeated and unwilling to abandon his own powers and left as a prisoner of the parliamentarians. He was offered his throne if he would renounce episcopacy, that's bishops, and the prayer book, and embrace Presbyterianism. Understandably, Charles chose his faith and bravely went to his beheading. In fact, he wore 2 shirts under his garments in case in the cold of January he shivered and people took it for fear rather than cold. He was executed on the 30th of January, which is why we're celebrating it today. It is said that the onlookers gasped when it happened, suddenly aware of what they had done. It's called regicide. They killed their king. And some of them mopped up his blood and saved it as a souvenir. Well, 10 days, and this is again how the power of the press was so important in that period. 10 days later, a book was published called The Royal Image. It was a series of reflections and prayers and meditations focusing on Charles' reign. It outlined how Charles sought God's guidance as he refused to abandon his duties and obligations as a Christian king. He acknowledged his mistakes and forgave his enemies. Well, the author claimed it was written from papers given to him while the king was imprisoned at Carisbrooke. And this convincing picture of a martyred king was the first step towards his sainthood. Although the monarchy was abolished in Parliament under the Puritan Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector held on for 10 years. On Cromwell's death, the people were tired of not having a monarch, and so Parliament issued an invitation to Charles' son to return from France and become King Charles II. With monarchy restored, the first step taken by the Church was to honor the man who'd given his life for its preservation. The last monarch, the last martyr to be canonized as saint, a saint of the Church of England. Charles had been offered his life if he would abandon episcopacy, but he refused. For this would have taken the Church of England away from being part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church and have changed her into a sect, in his opinion. However, his religious convictions were sincere, and he saw it as his duty to ensure that the church in which his people worshipped was part of something greater, part of this whole universal church. That's what the word Catholic means, the universal church, the church that Christ established, that we're all to belong to. As God's anointed and divinely appointed king, he had to take the lead. Ultimately, it was that which cost him his throne and his life and saved his church. And that's what the ultimate purpose of saints is. It's to do something remarkable, something that teaches us about how to live our lives as Christians, whether it's through their teachings, their writings, or their lives, or their deaths. The role of faith in Charles's life serves as an inspiration for us to live with honor of our faith, to not hesitate to stand up for what we believe in, and if necessary, to die for it. On the 19th of May, 1660, the Convocation of Canterbury and York assembled and acted to canonize King Charles as saint, and his name was added to the calendar of saints at the revision of the prayer book. Now, I've got to tell you, many of his citizenry, the Protestants, were absolutely appalled at this. They regarded prayer to saints as idolatry. And I will tell you, many Anglicans continue to agree with that position. However, none of them needed to have feared whatever side they were on. Out of this, eventually, the church grew to welcome both sides of the debate and become one of the most tolerant faiths in the world. Today, the Low Church embraces the tenets of those who followed Calvin, who cherish the Word and reject adornments and embellishments in their buildings and in their attire. On the other hand, the style and ritual of the High Church is in the manner that Charles sought to establish, while the Broad Church, which is where we sit, welcomes any style that brings a person closer to God and to the Word of God, whatever that may be. Today, outside of the society of King Charles the Martyr, few celebrate his feast. Fewer still would seek him out as a saint to pray to. And yet it's because of his willingness to sacrifice his life for his faith and his beliefs that we're here today, worshiping in an Anglican church, and with a minister who on the day of ordination, hands were laid upon me by those who had hands laid upon them, hands laid upon them in a chain of hands that reaches back through the centuries to the hands of the man whose life was given for all of us, our Savior, Jesus Christ. In our church, we commemorate lives of saints and heroes rather than create and worship saints. Unlike the Roman Catholic or the Orthodox churches, the Anglican Church does not even have a mechanism to designate a saint, should one wish to do so. Instead, since Charles, we've left that determination to God, with hope and trust that someday we shall all be saints in heaven. And may that ever be our prayer, that our faith may guide our lives to faith and wisdom, and someday lead us safely home. So may it be. Amen.
Amen.
And now, in honor of